Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
What do you got there?
Oh, hey, Nagana, listen, I brought in my guitar this morning, and good news, I've written a new theme song for the pod.
But we already have the William Tell Overture. I think people really love it.
Yeah, but it's so predictable, it's so old, and I thought we needed something, I don't know, a little updated, something that reveals more about who we really are. So I've got something new, and I think you're really going to like it.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, lay it on me.
I hear that podcast dropping, it's rolling round the bend. I ain't heard a good one since I don't know when. It's Negan and the Lone Ranger from the Winnipeg Free Press. When you hear those trumpets sounding, it's IO time again. Well, what do you think?
Really something.
Yeah, it is something, eh? Not bad. Okay, listen, I'm gonna kind of run to the little boys' room before we do the rest of the podcast. I am so pumped about this. I think it's gonna be big.
Okay, control room. Adam, are you there?
Hey, Nigon.
Did you record all that?
I'm sorry to say, yes, I did.
Okay, erase it. When he gets back, tell him there was like some sort of technical malfunction. Tell him that we're not set up to record music and we'll to try to get in the future and, I don't know, just make some sort of excuse up or something.
No worries, Nigon. I've got this.
One more thing. We're never, ever, ever going to talk about this, okay?
Talk about what? Right? In the radio production business, if you don't hit record, it's like it never happened.
Sweet.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Negan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Negan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome to episode 3 of Negan and the Lone Ranger, and we are digging out of a snowmageddon here in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory. How's your response of the first big snow dump of the season?
Well, it's funny when the first big dump comes, like both from the way people drive to the way they react, it's like they've never seen snow before. Like I guess it is kind of still kind of a shocking, like slap across the face. There's no extended fall. We're in the winter now. So I had Good Friday off, like a lot of people, but my Good Friday off was the snow clearing. I'm on a corner lot, so I have a really big parking pad area that leads out sort of onto the lane in the road. That's like really a lot of clearing. And then I will also say this year, I'm going to clean my front sidewalk. The side of my house is cleared by the city pretty well because we're on an active transportation route. But the front of my house isn't. And I wrote a column saying that people should clear their own sidewalks and stop being babies. And so, like, I'm standing outside, yesterday, and I'm just, like, dripping with sweat, right? Like, I've been out for an hour and a half, and I'm just, like, I got my heart rate monitor on, just to make sure I don't keel over. And I'm standing there, and I'm looking at that last 50 feet of sidewalk, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's not like, I'm super famous or anything, but somebody's going to drive along, take a picture of my snow-covered sidewalk and go, hypocrite. So I bared down and I went out and cleared the sidewalk.
I had the everlasting swamp of my back lane that started where there's just no place for the snow to go. And so it just ends up being piles and piles and piles, like somewhere up to 5-6 feet by the end of the winter. And so that started.
You got to throw it over the fence, man.
Into other people's yards.
No, into your yard. No, we are not advocating the throwing of snow into other people's yards. That's not what happened.
Well, I can tell you that, I sent pictures to all my colleagues at Power and Politics because they were like, make sure that you're on time and everything. And I said, well, I'm just digging out of this snow. And I was quickly reminded that whenever Winnipeg gets a big dump, Saskatchewan always gets it first. And so no matter what, the rivalry lives on. And they told us that, they got a big dump 2-3 weeks ago. And, that's the story of Saskatchewan, Manitoba.
So, really funny story while I'm out shoveling snow. And again, I built a fence. I had to rebuild the fence around my lot, and really got to know a lot of people while my fence was down. It was quite an interesting experiment.
That's a big sign, by the way. That's a big message about Western living.
Oh, no. Well, it's, the column that I wrote about it was kind of, the riff off the famous quote about good fences make good neighbors, which is completely misunderstood, right? Because good fences make good neighbors in the original context, because this guy, who's the voice of the poem, works with his neighbor every spring to fix the fence. Good fences make good neighbors. It's not to separate you from your neighbors. But when my fence was down, and it was down for a couple of weeks before I was able to get the time to rebuild it, where, everybody's looking at you, it's like living on the sidewalk, right? It's kind of interesting. And then when you start to build the fence, everybody wants to stop and have a chat. And so I got to know a lot of people. So one of the people that I got to know while building a fence stopped by while I was shoveling snow. And again, this is on Hayes Street, which is active transportation. So, boy, the city came by first thing in the morning after the snow and did the sidewalk plowing. And this lovely woman came by and said, well, if this is what the new city council is like,
it's just immediate
they
response.
rock. And I kind of said, well, I don't really think the new mayor and city council had anything to do with this. It's just, it's the city policy, and we're on a good route. And, if you want to thank somebody, thank the bureaucrats for, they do a lot of work like this, get the job done.
They look at the forecast.
Yeah, they get the job done. And she looked at me, she said, you are such an optimist. So, it's it's amazing the things you get blamed for as a politician. But you know what, new city councilors, old city councilors, get out there and start taking pictures beside those plowed sidewalks, because you've been doing good work. God's work.
I'm glad they're getting credit for this, because certainly none of us were expecting much of a response on our holiday day when the snow dump happened. I had an interesting experience involved. I have a lot of friends with young infant, toddler age children. And they, most of them have COVID. Most of them have had experience with health, or the typical flus, or there's kind of what they described as a cocktail going around at the moment of a mixture of COVID, flus, and then the typical kind of things that are going on when students go back to school. And last week, the ERs, the Children's Emergency Hospital here in the city, declared a state of emergency, basically, and said that the waiting times are through the roof and everyone should think about taking their children elsewhere from the Children's Hospital. And then at the same time, we saw Premier Heather Stephenson, who's the head of the premiers, the council, as they say.
Yeah,
and
Council of the Federation. Yeah.
And she's been really the face of this united front of premiers against the federal government for healthcare funding. It's very interesting, the state of health here in Manitoba, and the fact that the premier is out there talking about the issue of healthcare funding. And at the same time, really the state of healthcare here in Manitoba is at a crisis. It's at a tipping point. Last night, there was sort of a menu of how long do you want to wait for your children in emergency rooms? And the lowest amount was 4 hours.
Yeah. It's, I think that a lot of people who, subject matter experts, scientists, researchers, physicians, really wanted government to create, sort of a mindset in the public that there are definitely times where we're going to need to do some basic things to control the spread of viruses. We did it when COVID was new and it was deadly, and we have evolved into a different kind of threat from COVID. But in the United States and Canada, right, we're having the worst flu outbreak in 40 years, and everybody's trying to figure out why that is. And so, a bunch of ER docs and epidemiologists came out recently and said, like we really ought to be doing the simple and least painful things so that we don't have to do the painful things. And that the simplest thing is to wear masks in indoor, and
Doctors of Ontario called back this week. They declared that was it Doctors of Ontario or an association?
Doctors Ontario.
Yeah, they declared that we need to put the mask mandate back in Ontario. Of course, at the University of Manitoba, where I work, we've had a mask mandate the whole time.
Yeah, which is, and the university should be congratulated because you're swimming upstream against the current of public opinion. Even people that supported masks the first time are reluctant. But it's all like the thing that I was always most afraid of is when we started to remove restrictions and we removed the mask mandate in March. Side note, I got COVID 6 days after the mask mandate ended, after refereeing 3 double overtime hockey games in massively filled arenas. No surprise. But anyways, there always should have been a comma. We're getting rid of the mask mandate, comma, but if we need it, we'll bring it back again. The public health is most important.
It's going to be real tough to bring it back.
And we never did that. And now, I couldn't have imagined that in terms of the protections and, hand hygiene and keeping your distance and not going to work when you're, when you're super sick, I would have thought we had conquered all of that. A lot of it rooted in ignorance. But you know what? We're worse off now. How did we end up worse off?
Well, and not taking things seriously anymore. I mean, which is this, taking things seriously was what got us to success in the first place. And it's as my daughter just got COVID. Everyone I know has just had COVID for the second time. I mean, it's a real state of affairs here, and it's this $200 million investment that the province announced for healthcare in Manitoba really doesn't deal with the jurisdictional issues that the provinces have. They may have a united front against the federal government, but the real problem is that the provinces are giving out refund checks to people, and while there's a healthcare crisis, many of them are in situations where they want to give tax breaks to large corporations, the middle and upper class. At the same time, they also have real problems with jurisdiction. You have a big problem on each side of the border of provinces where you can have a doctor or a nurse, critical situation on one side, a suitable situation on the other, and you can't have a doctor travel across that border to do procedures, even in small towns, because it takes 6 to 8 months to get certified in that province. And it's a real problem, and the provinces aren't talking, unless they're talking about money. And that's the real challenge here. Speaking of sickness, Dan, I don't want to really let this topic go past us.
Yeah.
But the sickness that is called Twitter is a real, there's an infection there. And it seems to be kind of a situation in which they are even using the B word of bankruptcy.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk. Well, it's funny you should say sickness because I just read a column in the New York Times this morning about Twitter poisoning, and it's the author of the column is looking at Kanye, Donald Trump, and Elon Musk, and about how, they're all kind of distinct personalities in many ways, but about how they're all joined by this Twitter sickness, right? Which is this idea that every thought that comes into their mind has to end up on social media, that they think their thoughts are so important that they should change the course of society. And of course, it really hurts. This sickness really hurts because, they have a lot of sick thoughts. So, the thing I'm worried about, as you well know, in the newspaper business and journalism, we disproportionately rely on Twitter more than other.
Yeah, there's no social media platform that even comes close. I mean, Facebook is maybe in the ballpark, but in the way in the high stands. Yeah. I mean, Twitter is the most amount of energy that most of us and our colleagues put into. I've dedicated myself, most times subconsciously, to a very large following on Twitter, and that's really created this dependence for me as a writer to get my stuff out and to get my column read, because what's happened is that, like, how else do you access 25,000 people in a hop?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in the event that Twitter does collapse in under the weight of Elon Musk's arrogance, we're going to have to go to another social media platform. So I've signed us both up for hip hop dance lessons so that we can, because we're going TikTok, baby.
I don't think we can compete with Jagmeet Singh.
No, but I think that's another one that, the worse you are and the more shameless you are about demonstrating how bad you are, the more popular you are on TikTok. That seems to be what it is. And I can lip sync with the best of them.
There's nobody that goes more all in than you.
Yeah, indeed. This week's feature interview. We're very fortunate to be able to have Isha Khan, who's the president and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And I'm particularly glad that we're getting her right now, because the museum is hosting a big event that will take place a few days after this podcast drops, November 18th. 17th and 18th, actually, called Disrupting Discrimination, Building Culture and Inclusion in Sport. A member of the executive leadership team in the National Hockey League, Kim Davis, will be here. She's going to do an event with our good friend of the podcast, Kevin Chief, and on Friday with youth, and then another event on Saturday, a keynote address. And, viewing hockey and discrimination in a human rights context. I mean, that is
in Winnipeg, which
Winnipeg,
is just, part of the fabric and the culture of the city. You can't get out of it. And, this is in the wake of the Boston Bruin debacle with Mike Mitchell, and the fact that they hired this guy, or they signed this guy who was openly racist against a high school classmate, and bullied, and then that person who was bullied was issued a statement, which then resulted in being kicked off the team. I mean, it's impossible to not see the pertinence of this conversation involving hockey. People might wonder, what does racism have to do with hockey? And if they do, they haven't been listening, because the hockey world's really been ensconced in this conversation. Cards on the table, though, we're always supposed to disclose our relationships. And I did an event for the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Vancouver a couple weeks ago, hosted it. And on one level, the Museum for Human Rights has gone through a very difficult period where it's been criticized overtly for not dealing with issues of race, not calling residential schools genocide,
and problems with its own staff,
and then the internal workings of their own staff, and accusations of racism and discrimination. But since Isha Khan's come on board, there's been a real shift in the museum. Perhaps no surprise, as we've talked about a few times, that when a man creates a problem, there's a woman that comes in and cleans up that situation. And I really think that the previous CEO left a real mess. Yeah. And this CEO, Isha Khan, has just done an incredible job. And I saw it in Vancouver, and I think it'll happen right here in Winnipeg.
Well, let's go now to our conversation with Isha Khan. Hello, everybody. This is Dan Lett on his own, my compatriot in podcasting. Nigan Sinclair is traveling the world, people paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars to talk about important things. So he couldn't be here. We couldn't afford to compete with that kind of allure. But I am joined today, our feature interview, I'm joined by Isha Khan from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where she is the CEO. And thank you very much for making time to come into our little podcast den.
Thanks, Dan. I'm clearly also not traveling around the world for hundreds of thousands of dollars because I'm free. Here I am.
No, listen, Nigan breathes rarefied air. That's why I'm partnered with him.
So we can only hope one day, right?
One day, that's right. It's very hard to narrow down exactly what I want to talk to you about, because there's so much stuff that I want to talk to you about. But I will bring up the fact that very quietly, and I don't remember a news release or an invitation to a party or anything, that you very quietly celebrated your second anniversary at the museum in August?
I did.
Okay. Well,
and it was very quiet. Had to kind of remind a couple people, hey, it's been 2 years.
So no streamers, no small cake?
No streamers, just wow. 2 years sometimes feels like 4 months, sometimes feels like 6 years.
It probably, I mean, with the pandemic and everything, it probably feels like both. I mean, it's, because there was a period of nothing happening at the museum, the way there was nothing happening in places that draw people. So what would you, if you had to describe the last 2 years, what would you sort of say?
I definitely wouldn't describe it as nothing, because while nobody was coming into the museum because we were in shutdowns and all the rest, there was so much work going on internally. Just, an absolute reset, thinking about who we want to be, how do we want to work, who do we work with, and then just a lot of, honestly, reflection. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't sound like something you should pay people for. So I should be mindful of that. But just really thinking about planning. How do we tell human rights stories? What are the stories we need to tell?
You also came into the job at a rather tumultuous time in the history of the museum, where there'd been some concerns expressed about the relationship between management and the employees, some concern about the way the museum was internally, let's say, respecting issues of identity and those like that. So, what did you find when you got there, and where do you think you've come from those early days?
Yeah, when I came in, if you asked me about 3 months into the job, which everybody did, how is it? How's it going? What's really going on? I was really, really positive. And I would say, and I think it's because I didn't expect there to be so much internal motivation and desire for change. And there was, which probably is why it's been it's been this incredible journey. When I look back now, I would say, yeah, I mean, all sorts of organizations have problems. They always have. And that was the work I did before I came to the museum, is working with businesses and organizations on discrimination. Is it any deeper or more pervasive than it is in other institutions? I don't know that it is. And I guess I don't want to reflect on that. What I do know is that we have a commitment to try to change. And there's actually some movement. And it feels really good. It feels like it's just the work that you do every day. It's a practice, and it's not like behind us, and it's not over, which is maybe how I felt about the anniversary, right? Like, it didn't really mark much other than, I came today and wow, I've had this laptop for 2 years and it's already getting, getting kind of old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, publicly, it's an organization, like an institution with a high profile. It's connected to government, which is all these added layers of transparency and accountability. I mean, I think for those of us watching the story, there was the obvious irony of a museum that really does aspire to the highest ideals of the way we treat each other, perhaps falling short. How many, I guess I was trying to figure a way of asking this question, but so how many people at the museum now, I don't need an exact number, were there 2 years ago, and how have they reflected on, I guess they have to be a big part, if there's going to be change, the people who were there when you came in have to be a big part of that change.
Yeah, like when I walked in the door, or in those early days, everyone, I felt, whether it was real or not, this pressure to clean house, get rid of all the people who'd been there and bring in a bunch of new people. And I was very, very deliberate in not wanting to do that. So, let's work with the people that we have. And that said, people have come and gone, and I have brought in lots of new people who are fantastic. And they just change. You need a mixture, right, of both to create that environment you need for change. But I will say it's the people who in the early days were the ones who, sent me confidential emails, came and asked to speak with me. We had private meetings all through shutdown, those Zoom calls or Teams meetings where they'd really openly share what because I always just said, look, what do you want me to do? What do you think I need to think about? Those are the people now who say things have changed so drastically, and that it feels different. And I had someone, was an Indigenous knowledge keeper who we work with, say to me the other day, the energy in this building is different. The spirit of this building is different. And I really took it to heart because I feel it, but to have someone else remark on it, and in particular, Lee, when she did, it really meant something.
Well, I suppose that marks the 2-year period when you hear feedback like that. That's
I guess
good
so.
reward. The museum, like at this stage of my career, I shouldn't try to hide the fact that I'm a big fan. Was the big fan of the idea. I've been a big fan of the execution, from the building itself to the programming. I think what's fascinating to me is that, and I get all the news releases, and I have been in to see many of the special exhibits. I mean, it's kind of a finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world in human rights. Like you certainly, you do get a trip around the globe when you go in and see the exhibits. The state of the world right now, and I've been trying to understand this myself, there's certainly, as far as it can be measured empirically, there seems to be a feeling that that hate and all of its ugly offshoots is on the rise. That discrimination, it's gone from sort of in the closet kind of shameful thing, and now people are expressing it as a political ideology, particularly in the country to our immediate south, but not exclusively. This is like the really great journalist question. You're going to say something brilliant and no one heard my stupid question normally. Podcast. Damn.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's exactly. No, exactly. So what do you think's going on here? Like, is it, I think I in the questions that I sent, to Rory, your sidekick there, it was, the idea was like, is hate a pendulum? That, where the momentum swings from tolerance to intolerance, and that's our destiny as human beings?
Honestly, and I talked about this with Rory, who would never call himself my sidekick.
Oh, I'm
no, but I don't think it is a pendulum. I think, and when people say hate is on the rise, I would say reported hate crimes are on the rise. Note reported, because I think hate's always been there. Mm-hmm. And I think we are just, and I use the big we, are listening for it or paying attention to it in a way that we hadn't before. And I also say, particularly in, the quote unquote Western world, we see hate like we didn't before because we've been forced to or learned or evolved to pay attention to it. But it's always been there. Mm-hmm. So no, I don't think it's a pendulum. I think we're moving, and I think the fact that people are paying more attention to it, and we'd have this conversation, we'd report on things, we'd, kids in school would be talking about this stuff, means that we're advancing. To me, it's far more a journey than it is, pendulum kind of suggests you swing back to where you were before, in some measure, and I don't think so. I feel like we're going in the right direction.
I mean, I think the alarming, worrisome part for me, and nothing, the correspondence that comes to me through social media and my email account is by no means an accurate measure of the state of society. But, I do notice changes, and certainly since the pandemic, that kind of triggered an angry response to restrictions and to vaccines and things like that. What I see now is, an angry response where people who are saying hateful or really ugly things, are defending their right to say them. And in fact, not very effectively, but turning the tables. So, no, I'm not the hater. You're the hater. You hate me because I don't like gay people, or I don't like people of color, or whatever. So, you're hating. You're a hater. And I'm not saying that that's a brand new sort of debating point, but it really, like, it's worked its way into mainstream politics. And that's where I become really concerned is, when people who seek higher office in this and other countries talk like that. We have a far-right government in Italy right now. We have far-right governments and parties rising across Europe. And this is kind of that, no, this is just what I believe. This is a deeply held belief. You can't attack me for this if I believe that. So if we're on the journey, what are we on the bumpier part of the journey right now? Is that we got to go over the bumpy parts to get to the smoother parts?
I don't know, because I don't know where the journey. I know we're going somewhere, and I can't see the whole picture yet, right? But I think, you say a couple of things that are sort of strike me. Absolutely, it feels like there is more space for hate, and that ability, I don't know if it's an ability, but we're creating space to talk about it. You're the hater. No, you're the hater. But I actually think that, discrimination, hate in the way that we talk about it from a human rights perspective is so much more nuanced than people want to give space for. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to just throw it out like, I have my rights, and so therefore, you can't tell me what to do or what to think. And yet the conversation that's been happening underneath, which I think has been there all along, which is for dignity and rights and equality of opportunity, it is nuanced. And so I don't know that we're there fully embracing that. There are now pockets of people who are, dipping down into that conversation. Like, oh, I understand we need truth before reconciliation. Or, oh, I understand what colonialism actually did and the impacts. The people who are kind of living on the surface of talking about, I have my rights and you can't tell me what to do, it's still a pretty simplistic conversation that doesn't actually touch on the issues I think we need to. Mm-hmm. It for sure scratches them and brings them to the surface, but doesn't give us the entry point to actually talk about the real issue, about worth or dignity or how you want to treat your fellow humans.
Yeah, you mentioned the word nuanced, and that allows me an elegant pivot. I guess I'm not supposed to admit that it's a pivot to a slightly different topic, but are you nuancing right now? Yeah, I'm nuancing.
Oh, you're
that's
segueing.
Right.
Oh, thanks for telling me so. Okay,
that's right.
Good.
So you guys held an event in October, I believe, on attitudes toward the hijab. And now this for me, and partly through personal experience, is an issue that lays bare the nuances of a human rights discussion. So I'm going to go back to 2015 when the Conservative Party decided to make the hijab and religious images and head coverings and cultural practices an election issue. And, I remember Stephen Harper, trying to parlay this into the Conservative government championing, it was a woman's issue. We were championing the cause of women. And I was listening to him in the car and I'm driving along. And as I frequently do, I turned to my wife and said, do you buy that as a woman's issue? And she looked at me and said, yeah, it doesn't really matter what he says because he shouldn't be telling women what they should or shouldn't be wearing on their heads.
Exactly.
And I don't, for any of our 6 to 8 listeners who may have already figured
12 after this nuanced discussion we're having. Yes.
Like for those people who always saw that and always figured it out, like, good for you. Like, I think, for me, it was kind of a moment, it was a learning moment to kind of say, like, there was hand to the forehead. Of course, that's what it is. And, so when you did this event, and I wasn't able to go, but tell me what happened at the event and how people reacted to it. And, cause I think you've hit on one of the ultimate stories that requires nuance.
Well, we wanted to do something about women and women's rights. And, we saw what's happening in the States around reproductive rights. We saw the protests in Iran and then throughout the world. And at the center of it was the hijab. And so, a community partner reached out and said, we should do this event. And the CMHR got behind it because we should be talking about this. And we should be talking about a woman's right to control her own body, which to me is what this really is. When I think about the hijab conversation, though, as a Muslim woman, I have all sorts of my own thoughts about what I think about why we're still talking about this, why it matters. When I elevate, perhaps, to looking at it from a human rights perspective, it seems so odd to me that... So, I shouldn't say it's odd. People seem to look at the hijab as this thing they don't understand, right? The veil. It has all this somewhat romantic and other kind of thing around it, and as colonial or Western societies look at it as this, sign of oppression. You talk to many women, and not all, but many women will say, this actually gives me freedom. I choose to wear this, and I feel good that I want to wear this. Depending on the cultural context and families and all of that, it's different. But at the end of the day, it's the same idea that why should society tell anyone what to wear? Like when you gave it, talked about it in the context of that 2015 law and all the work that was going on around it, it seemed absurd, right? But I think when I think about that event and the idea that we're trying to build understanding and, human right, the CMHR sort of wants to be this place for dialogue and reflection. I don't think you get to the place of being able to advocate for your fellow humans until you feel some connection. And so you actually build some understanding. And I think we were at that event, we're still building understanding about what the hijab even is. Why do people even wear it? But there was a speaker who stood up from the audience from Iran. And she talked about what's going on there. And she said, this isn't, it's great to talk about the hijab in Canada, but don't liken that to the hijab in Iran. That's a completely different story with a military regime and all that. So again, a pretty nuanced conversation.
Well, if I've been fortunate enough that I traveled extensively in Sudan, which kind of purports to be an Islamic republic, but it's more nuanced than that for sure. And we met a lot of people, a lot of women, a lot of men in the civil service and in business. And, after a very short period of time, it wasn't unusual to meet a woman who is the head of a large business enterprise, wearing gloves, not shaking hands, wearing some form of head covering. And, so I think that if you have that advantage, you can kind of see the variety of different expressions. Unfortunately, we get to hear about imprisonment and torture and execution. And so I think do you think that, an event like this, it would be good to expose the content of an event like this to people who don't understand the nuances. How do you, or are you making plans to kind of continue the conversation in a way that might expose people who come to the museum?
Yeah, I think often that the people that we need to reach, you try to do the strategic planning kind of stuff, like who's your audience? And it'd be easy to say our audience is people who care about human rights. But if you challenge that, you think actually our audience is people who don't even ever think about human rights. Those are the people who you want to touch with your programs or your events or exhibitions. We know that we need to continue conversations about women's rights, wearing the hijab. Yes, maybe. Certainly what's going on in Iran and how that is used to oppress women and the human rights impacts, and in other countries around the world. But I think the goal really is to have a place to have the conversation. There were people who came genuinely just to learn. What is it? What's the difference between a hijab and a niqab? What are people talking about? Why do people wear it? Do they feel like they're forced to? And so even seeing 3 different women on the panel of different ages, 2 wearing a hijab and 1 not, I think that was enlightening for some. It's like, I really believe if we just build some relationships with different people who are different than us, is when we get to actually have some human rights movement.
Yeah, no, for
Right?
sure. This interview takes place a few days before another big event at the museum, which is one that partly connects to something that's very important in my life, which is hockey. I mean, it's about hockey, but not about hockey.
Right.
But the museum is going to host a series of events with Kim Davis, who's a member of the executive leadership team at the National Hockey League. She's the senior vice president of social impact growth initiatives and legislative affairs. And as I understand, she's doing events on Wednesday and Thursday. Okay.
Yeah, this week.
The question I want to ask you is, were you cognizant of the fact that you were inviting an NHL executive into Canada to talk about social impact issues at a time when the social impact of hockey itself is kind of, part of the national debate?
So when we asked Kim Davis to speak at this fundraising gala that we were having and on a youth event, we knew that she's doing amazing things around inclusion in sport, elevating the conversation around diversity in sport. So we knew that was important, and we were so excited to get her. We know now more than ever that that's a timely conversation. And so it just made us focus even more that this is exactly the time to have a conversation about inclusion, human rights, discrimination in sport. And I use that as this big thing, like it's a religion, right? So was I cognizant? We knew there was an issue to talk about even before the events that have led up to today. Or the awareness that we have today that we didn't have when we first asked her. Yeah.
It's hard to look at any professional sport right now and not see the way, the discussion of the athletes in the games and the standings, it's bled out now into, what effect they have on the society, what kinds of role models are you creating, that kind of thing. I guess I'm wondering what you think hockey people might get from a discussion like this. Because, it's what I have sort of been thinking about ever since I saw the news release. As an on-ice official, I'm lamentably exposed to the raw effluent of hockey. And there's a lot of stuff that gets said and done on the ice that is pretty objectionable, but it's punished. But it never really, there's no accountability or transparency to that's going on. So I wonder how you think hockey people might react to an event like this.
Okay, so first of all, I have to tell you, I am the lousiest professional sports watcher, keeper-upper there is.
You probably get so much more done in your life than I do, though.
No, I don't know. I'm just filling it with other stuff. But
No.
I have to put that out there.
Okay.
So I surely can't say what hockey people will get out of it. But, I can make all those generalizations about hockey people. And, as a hockey mom, when I had a kid playing girls hockey for a while, and I will say that I think that there is a genuine willingness to have this conversation. We saw that, right, with the events that have happened more recently that are in the news. You see the NHL speaking out. You see, there is a genuine desire to acknowledge that what is going on isn't how it ought to be. So I think that people will react positively in that way. I think, though, if you're a real hockey person, whatever that means, somewhere there it'll get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? There'll be a defensiveness, just the way that there is with anything that kind of starts to tell us, the thing we're doing. And hockey's a religion in this country, really. For a secular state and like other countries as well, we've kind of put all of that into sport in so many ways. And so it still starts to grind us a little bit when it feels like what we're doing, what we believe in is maybe not what we thought it was, or the people who we idolize or even just, promote as these fantastic heroes maybe aren't what we thought. So I think it might get uncomfortable. I don't know that this conversation will,
Yeah.
but I think the conversations that happen in the car ride home or the next day, or people who watch the virtual gala will, I think, have those conversations. But honestly, that's the point. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of doing it.
Yeah, I think making people uncomfortable, I kind of sometimes think that's what I do professionally. My bosses frequently tells me that my column is not my catharsis.
Right.
Which I respectfully disagree with on occasion. But I think it is, it's fascinating for me to think of the opportunity, even if there isn't a direct overlap, but to have a discussion about human rights in the broadest possible sense, connected to something that's so, embedded, and, maybe not as much as it was when I was a wee lad first playing hockey, but, we take something for granted that it's there and it's a good thing. And then all of a sudden, we learn that it's not necessarily the good thing that we thought it is. But but that all sports, gymnastics, bobsleigh, wrestling, I don't know of a top sport, elite level sport in this country that hasn't been touched by scandal. Is the sports through a human rights lens, can you see that as an exhibit or a subject to be dealt with at the museum? Because if you say yes, then we've made news. I'm going to call my editor right away. No, sorry. Yeah.
I think that sport is just another frame for people who gather, right? So we talk about the workplace, we talk about businesses and employers and all the things that go on there from a human rights perspective. Well, sport is just another place where people gather and humans interact with each other. And so if you look at it that way, of course, there are human rights stories. There's sexual harassment, there's sexual abuse, there's gender-based violence, there's racism, homophobia, all those things, transphobia. And so it's just another way of configuring how a bunch of humans interacting with each other who bring all of their own biases, all their own hate, when they have it, ignorance, together. And so for sure there's a story to be told. And we can look at, stories of the history of the Olympics, and we can look at across, I think, almost every sport. When we think about the headlines, there's a whole bunch, even just in the last while, but that's just a bigger reflection. It just mirrors what's going on in society.
Yeah. Yeah, I have all these stories that I tell from people because I tore down my fence. I live in a corner lot and then rebuilt the fence. And in the process of rebuilding the fence, I got to know all my neighbors a lot better.
Nice.
And, because I was having 3-4 decent conversations every hour, which is why it took me like 4 weeks to build the fence. But I did have a young guy come by with his son, and we were chatting, and he knew that I worked for the Free Press and that I write about hockey every once in a while. And he said, he's so keen to play whenever, and I just don't know. And it kind of broke my heart a little bit because, I think you have to be discerning as a parent, of what you're exposing your kids to. The other part of it, though, is that I don't know where you would go and what you would do to create recreational or sports activities for your kids where you're not, you're accepting a certain amount of risk, that you're maybe not going to be exposed to the right people all the time, just the way you are in the school system, quite frankly, because we have no ability really to choose who our kids' teachers are. So, but it hit me kind of deep because I was thinking, wow, maybe this is something hockey doesn't come back from. Even though it's really just hockey's turn for this kind of accountability. When people go through the museum, and it's obvious, and I know people who work for the museum, people get so much more than they were bargaining for. Some people know exactly what they're getting, but a lot of people don't. And it's kind of is that moment of realization, which I'll connect to my neighbor, was having this moment of reflection. Is that like a natural stage in the learning process to maybe to feel the pain of what you see first, and then from there we hope you move on to greater understanding?
I mean, I don't know if I'm able to sort of pontificate on it, but I do know, because I've seen it so many times in our museum and other human rights work I have done in my career, that you have to feel it. You have to feel touched by the issue. And we feel most touched by an issue when we can relate to it, because we start imagining it's our kid or our dad or our neighbor or whatever it is. And then we feel something, and then that's sort of that spark that then inspires you to perhaps advocate, or maybe just even reflect first and then advocate. So I think that, in terms of, is it hockey's turn or is it turn in sport? I don't know if there's turns. I think it's been there all along, right? It's just, it's your turn to be in the spotlight. And it's your, like you said, it's your accountability. Like, now what are you going to do when this is served to you on a platter? So you've got a choice. And, I think about it when I reflect on the CMHR and sort of the public, the very public issues that we had just around the time that I joined. I said, like, I know this is going on in businesses and organizations all over the place. And people had said to me, like, we know that you're in the headlines, but we all have this stuff going on. And so we're kind of watching to see what you'll do. So, I mean, I guess we take our turn being public about it. But to me, all this work around human rights work, essentially, or equity work, however you look at it, it's quiet work that you might show up in the headlines tomorrow, but your job is to do it every day in your sporting organization,
or your museum,
or at your newspaper, wherever you may be, right? Like,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. You've been a really good sport by allowing me to draw you into a conversation on hockey. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me anything I could like.
No, I think because I think that idea that every institution, has its moment of reckoning.
And I think also, Dan, it's when we think about institutions and their reckoning, you also have to acknowledge they have power within them. There's power balances in those institutions. And so just think of sport and the money in it and the people and the heroism and all of that. There's so much power. So anything that kind of tries to disrupt that, pokes at it, that's why we have these moments of reckoning. I mean, nobody is or that I know of, we're not talking about lesser known sports and what's going on in many other areas of sport, because it doesn't matter to us as much, right? We're not season ticket holders, and we don't have money and, contracts and all of those things so
we're grilling the sacred cow on this one, Isha Khan, thank you so much for coming in and doing this. I think I can speak for Niigaan and say big fans of the museum and the works that you're doing there. And I've diarized August of 2 more years from now, so we can we'll have you back and we'll do like a big 4-year celebration.
I expect streamers for sure.
Streamers and pastries or something. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Kwei, hello. My name is Pam Palmater. I'm a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, activist, and content creator from Eel River Bar First Nation. You are listening to The Storytellers. I would like to share with you a story about one of the craziest days I ever had trying to cram all of my work into 24 hours. And since CSIS may be listening to this broadcast, the names, dates, times, and locations are not included in this story so as to protect the innocent. So this day was back during the height of the Idle No More protests. Idle No More was the historic social movement led by Indigenous women, which exploded into an organic, nationwide protest movement which lasted for months. Indigenous peoples engaged in teach-ins, round dances, protests, and marches, trying to educate our communities and the public about the threats posed by the Conservative government. Conservatives were threatening Indigenous rights, environmental protections, and social supports, as well as curtailing basic democratic principles, rights, and freedoms. Obviously, we could not allow this to continue, so grassroots Indigenous peoples, together with our Canadian allies, stood together to make our voices heard. On one of those days, I flew to a First Nation to stand in solidarity with them as they engaged in round 2 of their actions on the ground, protesting abuses by one of the many transnational corporations that were extracting their resources, all without the free, prior and informed consent of the First Nation and in violation of their treaty rights. So we all gathered together early in the morning, packed our bannock and bologna sandwiches, and set off for the location. Some members of the group set up a protest at the entrance to the location, while others hung back in order to keep an eye out for the company's private security. They had been known to follow and harass Indigenous peoples in the past. The protest was going on for hours, with elders cooking fish and telling stories, and the younger folks drumming, singing, and holding up signs, while videos were recorded for social media. All of a sudden, we could see private security in the distance, so we raced to the main protest to ensure their safety in numbers. I can remember thinking how awful it was that we were put in this position. It was surreal. It felt like a war was being waged against us. Despite complaints by the company, the protest continued on for a few more hours, and then everyone left to prepare for round 3 on another day. I flew back home, and while on the plane, drafted my speech for a teach-in that was happening later that evening at a different First Nation. I arrived just in time to teach my class. The students always looked forward to getting updated about Idle No More actions happening across the country and were super pumped to hear about that day's actions. So while I was exhausted, their enthusiasm to learn more about Indigenous rights and how they can support us was very uplifting. And I needed that boost of inspiration because after class, I had to drive to the other First Nation and make a presentation on Idle No More. As soon as I arrived, I was greeted by a process server who served me with legal documents from the very same extractive corporation we had been protesting earlier that morning. This was perfect content for the presentation I had to give that First Nation because it was all about how governments and industry violate our Indigenous rights, as well as how governments and industry spend millions to subdue our resistance by surveilling us or sending in the big guns. Quite literally, cops or courts. As a joke, I told the crowd that were gathered in the community center that undercover law enforcement are obligated to identify themselves if asked. And to our surprise, but not surprise, 2 officers identified themselves. It was one of those funny but not funny moments that we as Native people often joke about. So after this incredibly long day, I drove back home and saw that one of the media outlets had sent me a reminder text that my opt-ed was due by 6 a.m. the next day. I don't even remember what I wrote, but the next day, the opt-ed was published. This is the life of Indigenous peoples actively engaged in resistance to genocidal laws, policies, and practices that threaten our lands, waters, and people. It is all-consuming. Imagine if our basic human rights were respected. We could put all of our efforts into nation building or language revitalization instead of defending ourselves from the ongoing war waged against us. Imagine.
The last issue we want to talk about today is the ongoing concern and efforts being made to resolve, I guess, to learn more about unmarked graves at former residential school sites. I think it's a story that's really captured the imagination of the entire country and not just the Indigenous population. But, as we saw with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools, there are growing pains with this process. Recently, there was a story in the Globe and Mail which detailed concerns from some of the people that are acting as the liaison between families of former residential school residents and government, that of all the money and assistance and pledges of support that the government is providing, there apparently the resources are only to be used to locate the graves. There's no money available for exhuming or examining the bodies and possibly testing for DNA. And, Nagana, I know Obviously your father was the commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you were a passionate advocate on the need to resolve some of these issues. What exactly is going on here?
So Kimberly Murray, who is the special interlocutor on this issue, appointed by the federal government, since the discovery of 215, and I say discovery loosely, I mean Indigenous people certainly knew that their children and sons and daughters and brothers and sisters were missing, but they didn't know where. And the uncovering of 215 unmarked graves found through ground penetrating radar at Kamloops, and then subsequently several other communities, Cowessess, and right here in Manitoba in Brandon. I wrote a column about that, all the different work that researchers were doing to uncover the fact that children's graves were at a site that had been sold by the city, and now a trailer park is on top of that grave site. There's been this ongoing move to try to figure out who is in those graves, what communities have been impacted, and then for the most part to try to give some kind of sense of closure, to tell families where their loved ones are, which is the most humane and human thing that could be done. But whenever Indigenous people's humanity is up for conversation, it's always a debate. It's any other group anywhere in the world, really, people would be talking about empathy and the importance of thinking of Indigenous peoples and how they're feeling. And this funding that has been provided is not only a few drops in the bucket for the larger scope of the issue, but also is very limiting in that it doesn't provide some of the key issues that are going to be required going forward. And they talked about this in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They said that it wasn't just about finding the unmarked graves, but also finding who is in those graves. And many people, I think, thought that the golden ticket, the golden information of where those children and who they were would be in those church records. But as was found this week, Kimberly Murray was talking about the fact that there's, those church records are very incomplete. And when they are getting big dumps of information, which the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, located right here in Manitoba, Treaty 1, is just not giving the answers that are needed and required. And so this issue will be going on for decades. It will not be solved easily.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in getting from where we are now to possibly a resolution for some of the families. But, are we talking about a lack of resources, a lack of commitment, an institutional reluctance to bring more burden, on the government?
It's will. It's really will. And what I mean by that is today, right now, there are 88 communities searching in unmarked grave, like fully legitimate unmarked grave sites that they want to know who's in them. Because in some cases, they aren't just children. They're also members of the community. They're also sometimes are people who worked in the schools, but they are majority children, undoubtedly. Because these places were places full of tuberculosis, full of a great deal of abuse and violence, murder. And so being able to answer those questions will be a question of will. How long is Canada willing to care about this issue beyond just wearing an orange shirt on September 30th? Mm. And when the rubber hits the road, will, the few hundreds of millions of dollars, which seem like such a large amount of money, but spread it over 88 communities, ends up being just a few drops in a very big bucket.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before the podcast, and I think we do probably have to recognize that there will be some hard limitations on this process. Certainly the exhuming and the examination and testing, DNA testing of 100-year-old graves. I think that's going to stretch science to the limit, or stretch it to its limits. But I think as somebody who hasn't followed the issue as closely as you, I was kind of shocked that wasn't part of the programming. And I think that's the part, like in terms of the will. So there's $220 million or whatever provided by the federal government. And then there's more money that certain provinces have provided. But the money is expressly not to be used for exhuming and examining the graves. And I kind of felt like it was bait and switch, like I kind of thought that inside I was going, okay, well, that's a good first step, like good on governments, plural, for doing that. And then all of a sudden, Kimberly Murray comes out and says, oh yeah, like we can't use any of the money to exhume the body. We can just
for legal costs.
Yeah, that was
that's
a big one.
That's the other part of it. I think that communities have a right when they find information to act on that information, and particularly involving the abuse of children. This is not something that's covered by the TRC. This is something in which families, any family, anywhere, if a child was in the care of someone else and that child was harmed, that child was mistreated, that child was murdered, there is cost associated. I mean, that's the way justice works in this country. And so the fact that this funding is not to be used in any way for legal costs is really a message to First Nations community that we really want the monument there. We really want the plaque, but we really don't want any other actions taken forth, especially against the churches, who, by the way, the Catholic Church is still resisting the millions and millions of dollars that they are owing to survivors, and the fact that Stephen Harper's government, that came out just recently, that Stephen Harper's government signed off on forgiving, as if they had any right to do so, forgiving the Catholic Church on their obligations has just been it's baffling, but it's also very unsurprising. There's a movement in the country. I think that the country, in many ways, is becoming distracted by the issues at hand in residential schools, and you can see that in the St. Anne's residential school decision that the Supreme Court decided on the issue of records. When it came to the St. Anne's residential school, the records that were kept during the TRC was talking about abuse, talking about the ways in which, but the way that the settlement agreement worked was that that would only be held for a certain amount of time, and if they couldn't get consent of survivors, that those records would be destroyed. There is a move in the country to think this is a done issue and to see this as a completed issue, that those records can be destroyed, and then all we have to do is wear orange shirts and march a little bit on September 30th, and somehow this will be all okay. The funding, came in this week for the new National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is on the campus of the University of Manitoba, and during that groundbreaking ceremony that just happened right here, my father and then the director Stephanie Scott of the National Center were both talking about the reemergence of residential school denialism, and that there's many in the country who still continue to deny the atrocities that happened at the schools. Those who want to make the argument that the schools were altogether as much good as bad, well-meaning, and the movement, I think, in the country is that they think this is a done issue. And that's why I think it's important that we talk about it here and elsewhere, that this is not a done issue. And, 88 communities can't be argued with, that they are right now searching for their sons or daughters in the earth right beside their territory.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I touch on this subject, and I've written several times about the unmarked graves, and how for me, as a journalist, but also kind of, it's hard not to refract this through my experience as a parent as well. The thing, that struck me the most was the fact that even in instances where a child may have succumbed to a disease or some other misfortune that wasn't malicious, they were buried in unmarked graves, and this is the kicker for me, and there was no attempt to notify the family of the death of the child. And that is such a dehumanizing aspect of this, that like anybody who has kids, anybody who knows anybody who has kids, to think that a child could die and there was so little concern or possibly shame or possibly, or
anyone held responsible,
or accountability, that they wouldn't take the time to notify the family that the child had died. So what you're talking about is like children disappearing, and the families unable to get any answers. As a journalist, we live in a world where we like to think we know a little bit enough about everything that nothing surprises us anymore. And, you've traveled all over the world and talked to people about similar experiences. I've been all over the world, and I've seen people struggling and living with the wake and destruction of genocide and war and things like that. And, I thought I'd kind of seen it and done it all. And when your dad's report came out, and I read right there about the about unmarked graves, it was like a cold slap across the face. That, like, how could we not have known more? How could Indigenous people have known so much about the unmarked graves, and somehow
and nobody listened?
So when did the report come out? The TRC report came out in
2015.
2015. The other thing that stuns me is that 5 years before this became an issue of national discussion and concern, until an actual unmarked, like a large unmarked gravesite was found. But it's there. It's in the report. And I remember various historians who somehow still have agency with some of the national newspapers and are allowed to write op-ed pieces talking about the misrepresentation of the residential school system. Can anybody explain 5 years before the action plan was launched? Anybody who's afraid of assuming the shame and guilt of a previous generation by acknowledging what went on better know now that we're actually doubling down on the crimes by trying to find the most expedient way of reducing it to a once a year ceremony.
And the movement that came out on a certain national newspaper to say, well, where's the bodies? Show me the bodies. The feds won't pay for finding the bodies. Communities shouldn't have to dig up their own children. And then on top of it is, we know that the atrocities have happened. You don't have to question that the atrocities happened. We have firsthand witnesses, both those who worked in the schools and those who attended the schools. Why is that not enough to believe that this is a national issue and to dedicate the willpower to try to give survivors and their families and communities, all of whom we are apparently supposed to be all in this together, why is it that we're debating that? And this is probably the most angering and upsetting thing of it all. And not that I wanted to end this week talking about it, but it really is evidence that this is the tone where that's set. And when we continue to let those who openly outright deny on the front cover of newspapers, we're not helping. We're doing nothing but sowing the seeds of discontent on an issue that really should be moving forward in a much faster way.
So do we honestly have any opportunity? Like, is there any reason for optimism that possibly from the strong messages coming from the interlocutor on this or others that we're going to regroup? Like, there certainly has been progress. We've made an attempt to go through and identify more of these sites across the country. Does anybody believe that's a first step?
Well, we're far beyond the first step stuff. Yeah. And what we are is we are in a situation where the first time in history we have a critical mass of Indigenous peoples in mainstream institutions, universities, major places like the National Center, government. And we also have a government good, bad, great, ugly. And, I certainly don't always say nice things about the feds, even on this very podcast. But this federal government is dedicated to the issue for the first time in history. No other federal government has done that, liberal or conservative. And that shows you that Indigenous peoples involved in institutions, voting, being involved in the affairs of the state is working. it's demanding change. And it's also demanding change of everyday Canadians who are aware of the issue, cognizant, and want to take action. There was a poll that took place to say that, the majority of Canadians know that there's a problem. They know that they want some reconciliation to happen in their lifetime. They just don't know how to do it. And an orange shirt is not enough. A territorial acknowledgement is not enough. Finding out where children are, who are those children in the graves, is enough. It is a part of that journey, and it's going to be something that we need to do in the future if we're to in any way, so-called, scare quotes, turn the page on this issue.
Well, the most that you and I can do right now through this medium and through the newspaper is remind the people who are in a decision-making capacity that we're watching. And in fact, I think there is a large community of people, a population in the country, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that are waiting and watching and, to see the right things get done. I think we're going to wrap up on that note, and as we always do, we're going to thank Adam Glynn,
CJNU. We've been here now for a couple weeks, and this is staff
truth
here.
Be told, we've moved in and taken that bloody place over. But
we actually there's a broadcaster doing a show, and literally they wait for us to leave the studio. So just the dedication, the CJNU staff, Adam. The great people here, we just feel like $1 million in the ways that we're treated, and the fact that we, all hours of the day, bringing our guests in and doing the editing, and we even gave them a very short turnaround to edit the episode for episode 2, and was able to turn it around just in a few hours. So way to go, CJNU, and of course all of our colleagues at the Free Press, Paul Samin, who we would not be here unless he dedicated resources and time to support us and gave us time to do this. And, everybody, our families too, our families that let us come down to the studio here and miss out on shoveling snow. Yeah, well,
Adam and I were talking about this ahead of time. Like we, honest, because listener may not know, but we do a lot of our recording on the weekends very early in the morning, 7:30 in the morning. And not to worry about whether or not it's affecting my marriage or Adam's marriage, because both of our partners are extremely glad to take over the whole bed when we get out early on Saturday morning. So it's like they have their best sleep of the whole week when we go out early to do podcasting.
My cat says the same.
God willing, back at you, hopefully in a week.
All right, miigwech, man.